I left, quietly after discovering my wife's affair. A year later, she found me, seeking forgiveness and a second chance. The morning I left wasn't dramatic. There were no screaming matches, no tears shed in front of her, no slamming doors or broken plates. I simply packed a small bag, left a note with no explanation, and disappeared into the gray dawn. It wasn't cowardice. It was the exhaustion of heartbreak that had hollowed me out. I discovered her affair 2 nights prior, purely by accident. A series of messages left open on her laptop, laughter that didn't belong to us anymore, photos of a life she was building with someone else while still sharing a bed with me. It was a quiet death, the kind that doesn't scream but simmers under the skin, a betrayal so intimate it steals the air from your lungs. We'd been married for 7 years. 7 years of shared dreams, small rituals, lazy Sunday mornings, and now it all unraveled into something I couldn't touch or fix. I didn't confront her because, honestly, I didn't want to hear her justification. I feared she'd make it make sense, that she'd explain away her disloyalty with just enough emotion to make me question my own reality. So I left. I moved 2 states over, rented a modest apartment, and got a job doing freelance work, something that kept me busy enough not to think, but not so occupied that I healed. For months I carried that grief in my bones, went through motions like a ghost stuck between worlds. I told no one, not my friends, not my parents. I deleted social media, changed my number, and slowly built a new routine. I'd go for long walks every evening, making up stories about the people I passed, wondering if anyone else carried the same quiet ache I did. I didn't date. I didn't look at another woman. Not out of loyalty to her, but because I didn't know how to be open again. How do you let someone see you when the last person you trusted gutted you in silence? Still, I wasn't angry, not in the traditional sense. I was just empty. Number grief doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers you into a corner of yourself you didn't know existed. That's where I lived, quiet, distant, invisible. And that's where I thought I'd stay, until she found me again. It happened on a crisp autumn afternoon, just as I was locking my apartment door to head out for groceries. There she was, standing at the bottom of the stairs, holding a crumpled piece of paper like it was a life raft. Her eyes met mine, wide and unsure, like she didn't quite believe I was real. I froze. For a second I thought I was imagining her, but she was there, older by a year, thinner perhaps, her hair pulled back like she used to do when she was nervous. "Hi," she said softly, almost like a question. I didn't respond. My body tensed, instinctively ready to run, but my feet betrayed me and stayed still. She climbed one step, then another, like approaching a wild animal. "I've been looking for you," she added, voice cracking. I didn't ask how she found me. I didn't want to know. I just wanted her to disappear as suddenly as she had arrived. But she didn't. She stood there, shivering in a thin sweater, tears pooling in her eyes. "I'm not here to make excuses," she said, as if sensing my resistance. I need to talk." I stepped aside. I don't know why. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of curiosity, maybe because part of me needed closure I hadn't admitted to yet. She sat on the couch, folded her hands in her lap like a child about to confess. The silence between us was heavy, almost sacred. I poured us both tea. Again, instinct. The same blend she used to love. When I handed her the cup, our fingers brushed, and the contact startled me. She looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but spiritually. Diminished. "After you left," she began, "I didn't know what to do. I kept hoping you'd come back, that you'd scream or yell or let me explain. But you didn't. You vanished." I nodded but said nothing. She sipped the tea, eyes darting around the room like she was looking for pieces of me she once knew. "I ended it with him the day after I found your note. Not because I wanted to save us. By then I think I knew I'd already lost you. But because I realized what I'd become. I didn't recognize myself anymore." Her voice trembled. "And I hated who I'd let myself turn into. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel something. But I was still frozen." She stayed seated while I paced the small living room, pretending to tidy up but really just trying to avoid eye contact. I couldn't trust myself to sit beside her. Too much of me still remembered the warmth of her touch, the way her laugh used to fill this kind of silence. But that version of us was gone, and I didn't know what stood before me now. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said gently, her voice thin, almost cautious. "I just needed to tell you I'm sorry. Genuinely sorry." I stopped moving and leaned against the kitchen counter, staring at the scuffed wood floor. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice low and unfamiliar to my own ears. She looked up at me with wet eyes. "Because I hurt the only person who ever truly saw me. And I can't make sense of why I did it, except to say that I was lost. Not because of you. You were always steady. I think that scared me sometimes, how much I relied on you to feel whole." I didn't know how to respond. Those words should have meant something, should have cracked the walls I'd built. But instead, they echoed into a space that felt too wide to reach across. "I'm in therapy now," she added, "not because of you, because of me." I needed to understand why I could betray someone I loved so deeply. Her honesty struck me in a way her apologies hadn't. It wasn't just regret I heard. It was shame. And shame, unlike guilt, doesn't perform. It festers. I watched her hands fidget with the hem of her sweater, the way she used to when she was scared of bad news. "When I found you weren't coming back, I went to your parents. They wouldn't tell me anything. I thought maybe you just needed time. But then the weeks turned into months. I started searching online. I hired someone. I know how that sounds. Desperate. But I didn't know how else to say goodbye. Or maybe ask if we could begin again." I inhaled deeply, feeling the familiar ache behind my ribs. I hadn't thought about starting again. I'd barely begun to live. "You can't just walk in and ask to rewind," I said quietly. She nodded, as if she expected that. "I know, but I had to try." And for the first time, I felt the tiniest fracture in my resolve. The following days felt like walking a tightrope between past and present. She didn't leave town immediately. She got a room at a nearby motel and said she'd give me space, only reaching out with a short message every couple days. Never pushy, just updates like, "I'm still here if you ever want to talk." I didn't respond at first. I buried myself in work, but even that couldn't fully distract me from the storm inside. I found myself walking past her motel some evenings, not sure why, maybe hoping to catch a glimpse of her, or maybe just reminding myself that this was real, that she was really back, and that I wasn't dreaming some twisted closure fantasy. Then one night, I saw her sitting outside on the steps, arms tucked around her knees, staring into nothing. She looked so human, so lost. I approached without thinking. She didn't react with surprise, didn't rush to speak, just scooted over and offered space on the step beside her. I sat. The silence between us was familiar now, not tense but contemplative. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked, still looking straight ahead. "Every day," she replied, "but not just the affair. I regret not telling you I was unhappy. I regret making you carry all the weight without ever letting you know how heavy it was." I nodded, unsure how much of that I believed or wanted to. "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm learning to be someone I can live with. I stopped waiting for you to fix me in your absence. I started trying to fix myself." There was something different in her now, something quieter and steadier, not desperation but awareness. She wasn't pleading for my forgiveness. She was laying herself bare without expectation. And in that moment I realized what I feared most wasn't her betrayal. It was the possibility of trusting again. She reached into her bag and handed me a small envelope. "These are letters I wrote to you over the last year. I didn't know where to send them, so I kept them." I held them, still sealed. I didn't open them right away. I just held them like they were made of glass, unsure if they'd heal or reopen wounds. She stood up slowly and said, "I'm here, but I won't stay where I'm not wanted. I just needed you to see that I changed. Not for you, but because of you." And then she walked away again. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the stack of letters in front of me like a quiet storm waiting to be unleashed. I didn't touch them for hours, just stared at them as if they might vanish on their own. The idea of reading her thoughts over the last year felt invasive, intimate in a way that terrified me more than it comforted. Eventually, just past midnight, I opened the first envelope. Her handwriting hadn't changed, still slightly slanted with soft loops on the G's and Y's. The first letter was dated 3 weeks after I left. She'd written about waking up expecting to see me beside her, about reaching across the bed and finding only cold sheets. She didn't make excuses. She painted pictures of the silence in the kitchen without our shared breakfasts, of the emptiness in conversations with friends who didn't know the truth, of the way guilt had wrapped around her like a second skin. I read letter after letter, each one peeling back a new layer of pain, confusion, self-blame. Some were angry, not at me, but at herself. Others were just lonely. She wrote about her therapy sessions, about memories she had suppressed from her childhood that were now bubbling to the surface. She talked about learning to be accountable, learning to sit with discomfort instead of numbing it with attention or validation. And most of all, she talked about missing me, not just the version of me that made her laugh or held her when she cried, but the version of me she had taken for granted, the quiet strength she only saw clearly after I was gone. By the time I reached the last letter, dated 2 weeks before she showed up at my door, my hands were shaking. I hadn't cried since I left her, not when I packed my things, not when I drove through the night, not when I spent my first lonely birthday alone in a diner. But now, these words, so raw, so real, broke something open. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. She had suffered too, and though it didn't erase what she'd done, it reminded me that healing isn't always symmetrical. Sometimes both people are bleeding, just differently. I sat there until the sun began to rise, a year's worth of unsent love and regret scattered across my table, like the remnants of a life neither of us had stopped mourning. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I called in sick, though the truth was more complicated than that. I needed time to sit with what I'd read, to untangle the knot in my chest that had been pulled tighter with every word of her letters. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching people pass by, wondering how many of them carried secrets like mine. Ghosts of love and betrayal, of choices that couldn't be undone. Around noon, I found myself walking toward her motel, the letters bundled neatly in my coat pocket. She wasn't outside this time, but when I knocked, she answered almost immediately. Her eyes widened, and for a second, neither of us spoke. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice low. She stepped aside without a word, letting me in. The room was sparse, a bed, a small desk, a suitcase in the corner. She'd clearly been living out of it, waiting, hoping. I sat on the edge of the bed while she pulled a chair around to face me. "I read them," I said, holding up the bundle. "All of them." She nodded, lips pressed tight like she was bracing for impact. "And?" she asked. I exhaled slowly. "They hurt, but not in the way I expected. They didn't make me angry. They just made me see you again. Not the version I remembered. A new one. A broken one. But honest." Her shoulders slumped in relief, or maybe sadness. It was hard to tell. "I don't know what that means," I continued, "or what comes next. But I didn't come here to yell at you. I just needed you to know I heard you." We sat in silence for a long while, neither of us pushing. "I miss you," she whispered eventually, eyes glistening. "Not just being married. You." That word hung heavy in the air. I missed her too, but I also missed who I was when I trusted easily, when I believed love was enough to shield us from human failure. "I don't know if we can go back," I said. She nodded. "Maybe we don't need to." There was something in that. Something that felt less like desperation and more like growth, not clinging to the past, but standing in the rubble and asking if something new could rise. "Do you want to have dinner?" she asked. And against all logic, I said yes. Dinner wasn't romantic. It wasn't candlelight and soft music or laughter echoing through a restaurant. It was quiet, cautious. Two people who used to know each other deeply, now trying to speak across a gap carved by time and betrayal. We went to a small diner, the kind with vinyl booths and waitresses who call you hun. She ordered a salad, I got a burger, and for a while we just talked about safe things. Work, books, movies we used to watch. There was a strange comfort in the ordinary. I found myself studying her face in a way I hadn't in years, noting the slight worry lines near her eyes, the way her lips moved when she smiled. She was familiar and foreign all at once. At one point, she reached for the sugar, and her sleeve slid up slightly, revealing a small tattoo on her wrist, something she hadn't had before. "What's that?" I asked, surprised. She looked down and smiled softly. "A semicolon," she said. "My therapist suggested it. It's a symbol for continuing a sentence instead of ending it." She didn't have to explain further. I understood. The year apart had clearly been more than just lonely. It had been dark. That realization hit me in the chest. I'd assumed she'd moved on easily, found peace while I was stuck in survival mode. But now I saw that she had been battling her own shadows, ones I never even knew existed. "I thought about ending things once," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just the affair, everything. But I didn't. I decided to live, to change, and maybe to try and make things right." It was the first time I realized how fragile she had become, how human. I felt a crack in my armor, not out of pity, but from seeing the pieces of her pain stitched together with vulnerability. When we finished eating, we walked in silence to her motel. Outside her door, she turned to me. "I'm not asking to move in, or pick up where we left off. I know that's not how life works. But if you ever feel like it, I'd like to spend time with you again, as friends or something like it." I looked at her, at the hope she tried to suppress but couldn't quite hide, and I nodded slowly. "Maybe," I said, and I meant it, not as a promise, but a possibility. We started slowly after that night. No grand gestures, no late-night confessions, just moments. She invited me for coffee once a week. Sometimes we walked around the park or browsed books at the local store. Always public spaces, always with the unspoken understanding that we were navigating uncharted territory. I didn't tell anyone, not friends, not family. It felt too fragile, like saying it out loud might jinx whatever delicate thread was forming between us. She never pushed, never asked what I was feeling or where I thought this was going. She just showed up consistently, calmly, almost reverently. That steadiness, ironically, reminded me of the way I used to be with her before everything fell apart. One rainy afternoon, we sat in the car for almost an hour, watching the droplets race down the windshield. "You know," she said, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had confronted me, screamed, given me the fight I deserved." I glanced at her, unsure what to say. "Maybe it would have been easier," she added. "Pain has a place when it's loud. But silence lingers." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to stay if I spoke, so I didn't. She turned toward me, eyes searching. "Do you trust yourself now?" The question hung in the air. I thought about it for a long time. "I'm not sure, but I'm learning." And that was the truth. Healing wasn't a straight line, and trust wasn't something you gave back like a returned library book. It grew again, if you watered it, slowly and cautiously. And she was different now, not just in words, but in presence. She was more grounded, more aware of her impact. And I was learning that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what happened, but about giving myself permission to stop carrying the weight. A few weeks later, I found myself laughing with her again. Genuine laughter, the kind that bubbles up from somewhere unguarded. It startled me. She noticed too and smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet gratitude. "It's good to hear that again," she said. It was then I realized we weren't rewriting an old story. We were writing something new, page by careful page. And even if it didn't lead back to love, it was leading to something just as rare, understanding. Not just of her, but of myself, of how broken things could still hold light if you looked through them the right way. By the third month of tentative reconnection, I had started to let go of the constant need to protect myself. Not entirely. Old wounds don't vanish, but enough to let a version of peace settle into my bones. One evening, as autumn settled into the trees, she invited me to a small gathering. A friend of hers was moving abroad, and there was a quiet farewell at someone's apartment. I hesitated, uncertain if I was ready to be in a space that placed us together socially. But something in her eyes, hope, but not expectation, made me say yes. That night, among strangers who had no idea about our past, we sat side by side on a worn couch, drinking warm cider and listening to soft music play from the corner. She introduced me simply as an old friend, and I didn't correct her. We talked with others, laughed a bit, and for a moment, I saw what life could look like when the past didn't define the present. On the walk home, she said quietly, "You looked relaxed tonight, like yourself." And I was, because for once I wasn't replaying every hurt. I wasn't comparing who we were to who we had become. I was just there, and so was she. A few days later, I invited her over. She hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure it was real. We didn't talk much. I cooked pasta. She helped set the table. We ate quietly, the comfort of routine filling the space. Afterward, we sat on the couch, and I finally asked, "Do you still love me?" She didn't flinch. "Yes," she said. "But not in a way that asks you for anything. I love you in a way that respects where you are. I love you enough to let you go, if that's what brings you peace." Her answer was the most unselfish thing she'd ever said to me. It melted something I didn't know was still frozen. I took her hand, not because I was ready to reclaim what we'd had, but because I saw her now, not as a betrayer, not as a symbol of pain, but as a whole person. Flawed, healing, human, just like me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone. Winter came gently that year, blanketing the streets in soft snow and muffling the usual noise of the city. The cold brought stillness, and in that stillness, something settled between us. An unspoken understanding that whatever this was, it had meaning. Even if it didn't come with neat labels, we saw each other regularly, not out of obligation or desperation, but out of quiet choice. Some days we talked for hours, other times we just shared space, reading in silence or walking through the park with coffee in hand. One night she brought over a box of old photos she'd found while clearing out storage. We sat on the floor, flipping through memories, weddings, birthdays, vacations long past. There were smiles and comments, soft laughter, a few moments that turned heavy with nostalgia. When we came across a photo from our honeymoon, her head on my shoulder, both of us smiling like nothing could ever go wrong, she paused. "I used to hate this one," she whispered. "It reminded me of how badly I ruined everything. But now, I think it just reminds me we were real, that we loved." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew what she meant. We weren't pretending anymore. Not that it never happened, not that it didn't hurt, but that it also had value, and maybe still did. Later that week, she told me she was moving to a new apartment, one closer to her work, a clean slate. She didn't ask for help packing, but I offered anyway. As we folded blankets and labeled boxes, there was a strange peace between us. No pressure, no declarations, just two people who had survived something that could have destroyed them. On her last night before the move, we had dinner one last time in her motel room. She handed me a final letter, written that morning. "You don't have to read it now," she said, "or ever. I just wanted you to have it." After she left, I opened it. It wasn't a plea or a love note. It was a thank you. For the laughter, for the silence, for letting her come back as a stranger and leave as something more. And maybe that's what second chances really are. Not rewinding time, but showing up again with clearer eyes and open hearts. We didn't end up exactly where we started, but maybe that's what made it beautiful. We ended up somewhere new, honest, fragile, and unexpectedly whole.